Welcome to part 2 of our journey around Great Asby. Thank you for joining us. In part 1 we travelled from the Three Greyhounds Inn in the centre of the village to Dale Green on its western edge. In part 2 we're going to make our way along the north side of Asby Beck, from Dale Green at bottom left to Marble Mill at top right. We'll start by turning away from Dale Green to face east. If we look beyond a 20th century bungalow, the gable facing us, that's the far gable that we can't see in this photograph, the gable facing us is that of this place, now Dallison House or Dallinson House. It probably takes its name from the surname Dallison or Dallinson. Parish registers show that Dallison or Dallinson with the N was a family name of probably just one family in the parish in the 1720s and 1730s. That may be an indicator that this house was first constructed around that date. Perhaps it was the home of, or even constructed by, a John Dallinson, whose wife Grace died in 1720 and who married again in May 1721. The second marriage was to be short-lived, for John died in August 1723. As we can see from the screen, this house appears to have been constructed on a lower portion of Fiddlercroft. It's possible there had been an earlier medieval farmstead here at the foot of Fiddlercroft, which was lost during a period of depopulation, or the house may have simply been an addition to the village's housing stock in the early 18th century. Next on our left is a modern housing development called Riverside View, constructed right at the beginning of the present century, on the site of what had been Riverview Farm. The position of Riverview Farm, which we can see on older editions of large-scale Ordnance Survey maps, suggests that it may have been one of the first tofts of the 12th century manor of Asby Winderworth. This aerial view of the old Riverview farmstead survives. The farm buildings and farmhouse are to the right of centre and lower right in this photograph. There is the white-painted Dallison House, which we've just looked at, to the left of them. The farm buildings were demolished to make way for building the new housing development, but the farmhouse still stands just east of the entrance to the modern development. Here it is, now just another part of the domestic villagescape, but its typical linear arrangement points to its past life. I'll give you a few more moments to take it in, with the living area to the left, as you'll now be familiar with, former byre and hayloft to the right, now converted to additional living areas. Just past the surviving farmhouse of Riverview is this building, Ion House. It's yet another good example of the linear farmsteads of Great Asby, and yet another illustration of the way in which those parts which once housed cattle and stored crops have been converted to domestic use. Until relatively late in the 20th century, the eastern end of this building, to the right as you're looking at it, would have been used for livestock and fodder. Wherever possible, use would be made of the natural slope of a site, as it was here, to ensure that animal effluent flowed away from the domestic part of the building. Iron House was also the location of one of a number of small shops to be found in the village in the 19th and 20th centuries. A grocer. Today there is no shop in the village. The name of the house, Ion House, probably comes from that of a previous occupant. The surname Ion can be found in the parish register from 1669 to at least 1790. The name itself is probably a variant of the commoner surname Hine, with the loss of the initial H. As a further indication of the family's presence in the parish, there are fields once called Ions and Ion Guards, the second element of that latter name, from an Old Norse word for enclosure. Both are located in the manor of Little Asby, together with an Ions Wood. If you look to the north, immediately beyond the eastern end of Ion House, through the yard of the next door house, Midtown Farm, both are marked at lower right, you can see the rising ground of narrow crofts which ran from the back of the farmsteads. Here, as we saw in part 1, is Croftley Lunnon, to the left of the screen, the back lane which gave access to the crofts, as well as providing a routeway. You can see the line of it going from the bottom to the top of the left side of this Google Earth image, a routeway to one of the old common fields of Asby Winderworth Manor called Stannerstones, which lies just out of shot at top left. Beyond Midtown, and a line of more recent housing, are 3 more linear farmsteads: the White House, Ivy House and Elm Tree. You can see their names in an arc from lower centre of the screen. It's possible that these 3 farmstead sites all date from what we described earlier as the planned Norman settlement. Each of them, as we observed then, will have been rebuilt a number of times, and each has a visible date stone marking one episode of rebuilding. Here, a date stone of 1748 for the White House, together with the name Robert Robinson. His name stands alone, and he could be the Robert Robinson living in the village at this date, whose wife, Isabel, had died in early January 1737. Here is what is almost certainly a repositioned dated lintel, now at the rear of Ivy House, dated 1691, together with the initials I.S., perhaps Johannes or John Spooner. I suggest the surname Spooner because this stone is very similar in style to a date stone on Dial House in the village, which almost certainly refers to an Edward Spooner. We'll look at that in a few moments. And finally, less clear, I'm afraid, this one, 1694 for Elm Tree, along with the initials IR and TR. Perhaps 2 brothers, for the initials aren't laid out in the triangular arrangement normally used for the initials of a married couple, but we don't know their identity for certain. As a possibility, it could be Johannes or John and Thomas Robinson, both born in Asby Parish, who would have been in their mid-30s in 1694, the date on this stone, of course. All of the date stones almost certainly show dates of rebuilding, and the latest, 1748, for the White House, probably indicates a rebuilding which gave the house its more formal front elevation. When legal judgments made it possible for customary copyhold tenants of manors to bequeath their tenancy to their heirs, properties held under this form of tenancy became akin to freehold. There was then a preparedness to invest in these properties, prompting, as we've already noted, a great deal of rebuilding in stone between the mid-17th and the mid-18th centuries. Each of these date stones, as we've just seen, falls within that period. Here we can see that the farmstead of Elm Tree has undergone considerable further change, including a 2-storey extension with a much higher roof line, probably built in the late 19th or very early 20th century. The older, lower structure to the left, the one with the 1694 date stone, still has a spiral stone staircase in an outshot at the rear of the building, a not uncommon feature in this region. The steps are much worn, probably by the iron protectors that were fitted to the base of alderwood clogs. This staircase in the older part of the building may have been constructed at a time when the upper floors of houses began to be used for sleeping rather than just for storage. We're looking at land which is beyond and behind the eastern end of Elm Tree Farmstead. This had the name Browse. The label is towards centre top of the screen and derived from an Old English word for a downward slope. It's possible that this remained a slightly elevated area of open rough grazing quite well into the medieval period, at a time when other land close by was either crofts or part of the town fields of the manor of Asby Windowath. The survival of the name Brow here, you can see at the bottom centre of the screen as well, suggests that the bottoms, you can see those names at lower centre right of the screen, may have been the first crofts, and they were extended later by enclosing part of Browse to form the crofts which, as you can see, are called Low Croft. Northwest of Browse, you can still see that name in the bottom right corner here, are fields where the shapes of the relatively long but narrow cultivated strips which tenants of the manor held in the town fields have been fossilised by hedges and walls which were put around these strips when they began to be enclosed, as we mentioned near the start of our journey, perhaps as early as the 16th century. A number of fields here bore the name Stannerstones or Stangerstones on the 19th century tithe map. A few have been marked on this screen. All were probably part of what was once a single, large, common field of that name. We mentioned it a few minutes ago when speaking about the track Croftley-Lonham, which was probably the route villagers used to access this field. The name may be derived from the Old English standander, standing, and the Old English stain, stone or rock. However, it's incorrect to think of this as referring to standing stones in the sense of what we know of them in a prehistoric context. One of the place name specialists of the Northwest points out that boulders and exposures of bare rock frequently found in the region are commonly described by words which include the Old English standander. Some boulders, mainly glacial erratics of Shap granite, can still be seen lying on the Stannerstones field. They may once have been used as mere stones or boundary stones to mark the boundaries of tenant strips in the otherwise open medieval town field. A number of 18th century references to Stannerstone Field in the Asby Windowath Manor Court Book imply that it was common or town field, but a later legal document of 1882 specifically describes a parcel of land lying and being in a common field called Stannerstones. Indeed, within living memory, the field here called Stangerstones on the screen, it's marked above and slightly to the left of the field house at the bottom of the image, was still known by villagers as Town Field. It contains several dales or shares of meadow, still in unenclosed strips. Local resident Arnie Morn recalls, and these are his words, people went up there to scythe it. Then, Arnie says, people only had 2 or 3 cows. You didn't need much hay. Let us go back to join the route of our walk. Back on the route of our walk, if we turn away from Elm Tree to look to our right towards the line of the beck, we see this line of building. Let's stay with an aerial view of them. They're close to Asby Beck, which was clearly dry at the time Google Earth gathered this image. You may remember this line of buildings from when we looked across at it in part 1 from the other side of Asby Beck, for this was once the village smithy, with a now lost set of stepping stones close by. Another part of it was probably the blacksmith dwelling, and the remainder used for storage. It was clearly yet another encroachment on the village green, but encroachments of this kind for buildings which served a community purpose, like a blacksmith shop, were relatively common. The extreme west end of this building, as mentioned earlier on, is a relatively recent addition, but the area next to it would have been the blacksmith shop with the bellows, forge and anvil. At least one house in the village has a 19th century cast iron range bearing the name of the village blacksmith, a John Hewitt, who was here in 1885. It was perhaps made here, although there's some evidence that village blacksmiths sometimes bought in ranges of this kind and then placed their own name upon them. Samuel Smiles, writing in 1863, suggests that this very smithy was also the place where a famous son of Great Asby, Joseph Clement or Clement, born in the village, probably in Town Head, in June 1779, learned his first metalworking skills. He became the leading precision tool engineer in London in the first half of the 19th century, and, most famously, he worked on Charles Babbage's difference engine, generally regarded as a mechanical forerunner of the computer. Before we move on, let's glance inside the nearby bus shelter, just to the right, to look at that mural depicting Great Asby in 1911, which we first mentioned when we began our walk outside the Three Greyhounds. Remember, there is a link from the Asby Parish website, asbyparish.org.uk, to take you to the contents of this interpretation board if you want to look at it in more detail. Hover over Interests on the first page of the website, select History Group, scroll down to find Past Projects, and find a bullet point with the link to this panel. Alternatively, you can purchase a copy of the booklet, Great Asby, A Guide to the Village 100 Years Ago, which was inspired by this mural. The most convenient place to buy it may be at the bar of the Three Greyhounds Inn, at a cost of £3. In this booklet, you can read how information from the census of 1911 and the Land Valuation Survey of 1910 was combined by Graham Parkin and Valerie Mandelson, both of Asby History Group, to reconstruct and repopulate a number of the households of Great Asby in 1911. Just across the road from the bus shelter is Bridge End House, marked at top right. This is an example of a linear farmstead which may have undergone changes extending over quite a long time. As far back as that Land Valuation Survey of 1910, there was already a small cottage next door to Bridge End House, and next door to that were outbuildings. Since then, the small cottage has been incorporated into Bridge End House, and land which held the outbuildings now has a newer range of 3 houses. Although old photographs show that the house nearest or closest to Bridge End House is on the footprint of at least part of a bank barn that was attached to the farmhouse. Perhaps this was the first example of that change of land use from now redundant farm buildings to small housing development that we mentioned when we were looking at Riverview Farm a few moments ago. Next door to that range of 3 newer houses adjoining Bridge End House is yet another linear structure which has undergone much change. Dial House and Hunting House, shown here at the centre of the image, were once a single farmstead, known variously as Church Farm, Back of Church, and certainly by the interwar years as Dial House. The building that retains the name Dial House, we looked at an imagined floor plan of it in the 18th century as an example of a linear farmstead at the start of our walk. Dial House was once the domestic part of the farmstead, with a back kitchen at the western end of what is now Hunting House. What is now the dwelling called Hunting House would have been the so-called down house of the linear farmstead. The entrance to the old through passage or cross passage of this linear farmstead, it's now the front door of Hunting House, would once have been the principal entrance to the whole building, leading on one side to that back kitchen we've just mentioned, which had a small room above it that was probably occupied by one of the farm servants, and on the other side it led to a byre which had a hayloft above. Indeed, the whole building can probably be truly called a Cumbrian longhouse, because, as far as we can tell, both people and cattle would have used the same rear entrance to the cross passage to access it. Cattle would then have turned to the left and people to the right. On the lintel of the front entrance to the cross passage, now, as we've said, the front door of Hunting House, there is a date stone. The inscription on this date stone is often a little obscured by foliage, but it is marked 1680, and with the initials ES to the left of the date. Only a few minutes ago I spoke of the similarity between the style of this stone and one that has been moved to a position at the rear of Ivy House. ES, as I said earlier, when we looked at the Ivy House date stone, is almost certainly Edward Spooner, a long-lived and prominent villager in the second half of the 17th century and early 18th. 1680 was probably the year in which this downhouse or agricultural section of the longhouse was built or perhaps rebuilt. If it was a new building, then the doorway beneath this dated lintel may have replaced an entrance which would have been in the now concealed eastern gable of what would have been an even older domestic structure of Dial House. This kind of development, from a gable door to a cross-passage entrance, was not unusual in Cumbria. But there is yet another, later date stone above the front door of Dial House. This shows the initials IEA in the centre, as well as the date of 1729, split, as you can see, on each side of the initials, and is probably evidence that the older domestic part of the linear structure was itself rebuilt at this date. The initials I and A at the base of the triangular arrangement of the letters represent the first letters of the respective forenames of the husband and wife. The I is probably for the earlier spelling of Johannes, for John, and the A almost certainly is for Anne. The E at the top is for the first letter of the surname, Elliotson. We can be fairly confident about all this, because a John Elliotson acquired part of the manorial holding of Edward Spooner after Edward's death. The creation of a new and fashionably central front doorway, like the one where this date stone has been placed, to replace the cross-passage entrance built by Edward Spooner, was a typical 18th century development. Together with Dial House and Hunting House, other parts of this farmstead, which were once working buildings, provide a good example of how some individual old family farmsteads have been converted to create a number of dwellings on the site of each farmstead. This farmstead's barn, once with a porch at its cart entry, now called Dial Barn, there it is, the top centre, and part of the footprint of the old cow house, now called Ray Cottage, are, respectively, a conversion to a house and the position of a late 20th century single-storey dwelling. Here we're looking across part of the churchyard towards a wall enclosing the front gardens of Dial House and Hunting House. When the church was demolished and rebuilt in the mid-1860s by the lady of the manor, Anne Newell Hill, her steward, William Thwaites, owned Dial House, although not living there. That connection may explain why the garden wall of the property is built in the same materials and style as the churchyard wall. In this photograph you can see both walls, and there could be another link between Dial House and the church. We've come into the living room of Dial House, a room that was often called the firehouse because it held the fireplace, to find that possible link with the church, a link with the old church. This cut and rearranged 17th century panelling, which separates the firehouse from the parlour on the ground floor, was probably once part of box pews in that old church, demolished by Anne Newell Hill in the 1860s. Again, as with the garden walls, it may be the fact that Dial House was owned by her steward, William Thwaites, which explains the reuse of the box pew's timber within this building. Now we'll take to the air, beyond the eastern end of Dial House Hunting House, to find a footpath. And here it is, marked red, running to the north towards Scalebeck at top left. This may have been yet another of the trackways. Remember, we saw two on the other side of the beck and Croftley Lawn on this side of it, which gave access to manorial cultivated common fields. If you follow this track towards Scalebeck, it takes you close to more fields which have characteristic curving boundaries, which suggest that they fossilise the shape of strips of land that were ploughed repeatedly by teams of oxen. Those fields are outlined in yellow here. We've come back into the village, near to the start of that path to Scalebeck, to continue our walk eastwards. As the churchyard wall of St. Peter's curves to the right, there is a plaque in the wall, its position marked here with a yellow pin, which commemorates the construction of an extension to the churchyard in 1919. The area of that extension has a green arrow and star inside it. But as well as the plaque in the wall, there also survives a photograph from that event. Here it is, showing men who carried out work on the extension as a boon day or gift to their community. It hangs in the church, and we'll encounter it again in part 3 of our village walk. Given the recent pandemic which affected the world in the early 2020s, it's worth noting that this extension of the churchyard took place right in the middle of the preceding major pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920. But there's little evidence in this photograph of the so-called social distancing observed during the pandemic that was to occur 100 years later. We'll move on, only a short distance, to Well Green, the location of St. Helen's Well, and once known by the slightly fuller name of St. Helen's Well Green. More about the well in a moment. Well Green is also the name given to a house which looks across the green to the beck. Its position is marked on the screen. The setting of this house is something of a puzzle. By now, you may have acquired a good enough sense of the general framework of the village, which, remember, we're conjecturing as a planned layout of the Norman period, to expect to see each house with a rectangular croft behind it. Let's shift our viewpoint to see this house in its wider context. We can see that the relationship of Well Green House to its immediate landscape differs from that of almost every other toft or building plot in the village. For instead of having a long, narrow croft field immediately behind it, it appears to be positioned at the edge of an irregular, roughly circular enclosure, albeit one which has, at some unknown date, been divided. Most of it is called park, which is derived from an Old English word for enclosure. There is clear evidence that this park was once enclosed by earthen banks before changes to the boundaries of it in the later 19th century. Banks which may also suggest that it is of an early date. An irregular enclosure of this shape could perhaps date from an earlier pre-12th century, pre-Norman period of settlement. Although the farmstead here will have been rebuilt on more than one occasion, it's possible that this was the site of a pre-conquest farmstead. It's close to the site of a ford, and also very close to what has been, as far as we know, a never-failing source of water, St. Helen's Well. And is the curve in the line of the road in front of Well Green House, marked by a small blue arrow at bottom centre of this image, below the house name, is this curve an indication that the road was respecting an earlier structure where the house is positioned today? The road then curves again to respect the site of what may have been another early building, a pre-conquest church. More about that possibility later on. First, let's take a closer look at the well, another part of what we might regard as the old sacred core of Great Asby. Here is the well, viewed from the Asby-Coatsford side of the beck, with the village almshouses beyond. More about them in a moment. Well names often refer to springs or small streams rather than pits or shafts, and here the name is given to a resurgence, where water from an underground stream reaches the surface, one of a number to be found along the upper reaches of Asby Beck. Springs of this kind were often sacred places in pre-Christian times, and it's not uncommon, as may be the case here in Asby, for later places of Christian worship to be constructed close to sacred sites of pre-Christian times. The name, St. Helen, if not from St. Helen or St. Helena, the mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine, could be linked to a displaced deity, one that does predate the Christian tradition. The first possibly displaced deity, Hel, as you can read here, is associated with Norse and Norse language influences in the region that we've already very briefly touched on. In Norse mythology, Hel is a daughter of Loki and Angerboda. She was cast by Loki into one of the 9 worlds of the very complex Norse mythological structure. There, it was her task to look after those who did not die an heroic or notable death, those dead because of disease or old age. It may not be too difficult to imagine a source of water coming out of the ground, coming from the underworld as it were, being referred to by Norse or Norse-speaking settlers as Hel's Spring. That Hel's father, the Norse god Loki, featured in the minds of those living in the Westmoreland landscape during the period of some Norse settlement, may be evidenced by a carved stone to be found in the church at Kirby Stephen, a few miles to the south. This carved stone, known as the Loki stone, is generally thought to be a 10th century representation of the Norse god, bound and chained. There was significant Norse settlement in the Upper Eden Valley in the 10th century. This carving of Loki is one of only 2 of its type known in Europe, and the only one in Britain. If you haven't already seen it, next time you're in Kirby Stephen, go into the church to see it. A second possible displaced deity could be Ellen, a Celtic goddess with 3 heads, who, in Irish tradition, used to emerge periodically from a cave, believed in Christian times to be a gateway into hell and traditionally associated with the pagan otherworld. Remember, parts of northwest England remained places of Celtic or ancient British influence until quite far into what we regard as the Anglo-Saxon or early medieval period. So, in this suggested association as well, the place where this spring emerges from the earth here may have been seen as an entrance to the underworld. But away from these mysteries, a more prosaic, a simpler and perhaps more common derivation from the name of St. Helen's Well may be from the Old English word Ellen, the elder tree. Perhaps once upon a time there was simply an elder tree close by. Make your choice. A village building which once took its name from the well is the immediately adjacent almshouses. In this plaque, which is on the wall of the almshouses, we see the name of the founders, William and Joseph Farrer, and the date of the provision of funding by these two brothers. In some 19th century documents, these almshouses are referred to as St. Helen's Hospital, hospital in the sense of refuge or place of safety. Here we're looking at the almshouses from the west. There are 4 separate units of accommodation under a single roof. In November 1813, an application was made in the court of the manor of Asby Winderwath for permission to erect an almshouse upon St. Helen's Well Green and take a small quantity of ground adjoining for gardens for the use of the said building. A document exists from July 1818 which implies that 3 cottages were built at first and then a 4th was added when additional funds were made available. But, looking at this photograph, it's very difficult to see such a building sequence in the present structure. It appears, with its regular shape and shared chimney stack, to be all of a piece. Perhaps the words of the 1818 document simply mean that additional funds made it possible to build a 4th cottage from the outset. In this same document of 1818, each tenement of the almshouse is described as having a room above and a room below, with a coal shed and a small garden. This remained the case until just after the Second World War, when small extensions containing bathrooms and kitchens, you can see one of them here, were added to each gable, with the plaque commemorating the founders repositioned. Let's stay in the air and look across the road north of the almshouses. We're focusing once again on that irregularly shaped enclosure, park, which has the farmstead of Well Green at its southern or slightly southwestern edge. We've already noted that the name park derives from an Old English word which simply means enclosure, rather than any of the grander associations we might have with that word park. But I suppose there may be some slight possibility that it could at one time have been a small medieval cow park where milk cows were grazed before they went out later in the year to summer pasture on open fell, beyond the ring dyke, which protected the common arable fields and meadows from the predations of grazing livestock. Just to the northeast of Park, beside the probably 19th century moor plantation, is a group of fields called hags. We first encountered that name when talking about the old manor gates in part 1. You can see the position of those hags here, just slightly left of centre at the top of the screen. Their name may derive from yet another Norse word, this one for felling of trees, and may indicate that this place was, in medieval times, an area of managed coppiced woodland. For hag came to be a word used for a section of coppice that was to be cut in 1 year. We're going to go down to the ground now, to the place marked with a yellow pin towards bottom centre of the screen. We'll place our backs against a gate and turn our gaze away from Park to look across the road towards a small barn. As you can see, it's a barn with a flight of stone steps, which give access to a first floor door in the gable wall. In turning around from Park and the hags, we've shifted our gaze across many centuries, away from carefully managed medieval coppice, to a building closely associated with local generation of electricity from the 1920s to the early 1950s. In 1928, the Great Asby Electric Light and Water Company began to generate electricity at the former corn, bobbin and sawmill at Rutterforce, a couple of miles, more or less, northeast of the village. Overhead wires carried the power generated by a turbine to this building to charge a rank of glass wet batteries. The batteries were housed up the steps on the first floor. On the ground floor, an engine-driven dynamo augmented the power in times of low water flow at Rutter Force. By 1928, cables running from this barn were powering not only the church, chapels, farms and private houses, but also the first village streetlights of Great Asby. Next door to the battery storage building is a house called Banks View, probably once the home of William Farrer, one of those two brothers who founded the almshouses. This house, being on the north side of the beck, might be thought to be in Asby Windowath Manor, close to the village green, and perhaps might also be thought to be another example of an encroachment house. But in fact it's built on an area of land that was part of Asby Coatsford Manor, which is mostly on the other side of the beck, of course. The name of the house, Banks View, may not have anything to do with the banks of the beck which lie behind it, but more to do with the view from the front. In this direction he would once have looked out upon those earthen banks which used to enclose the field called Park. Just as we pass the eastern end of Banks View, we can still see the remains of those banks, perhaps very early banks, on the surface of the ground. This closer Google Earth image is just about good enough to allow us to see the faint surface mark of the banks, to the right of the white line on the screen. These banks would have formed the boundaries of Park before additional land between the banks and the present-day dry stone wall by the roadside to the right of them was enclosed in the mid-1870s. If we continue eastwards along the road, we see on the south side of it a couple of modern houses, before we reach two older buildings. These older buildings were, in the first decade of the 20th century, another single linear farmstead called Kiln Scar. That name is marked just above the centre of the right-hand edge of the screen. The name has now been taken by the easternmost of the two houses. The Land Valuation Survey of 1910 notes that there was an old cottage here that was then being used as a wash house. The present owner of the westernmost of the two houses recalls that this old cottage had a large oven or fireplace. This may have been what was used to heat water for the wash house, but another possibility suggests itself. That possibility has its roots in the name of this place, Kiln Scar. Could that word kiln have referred to a communal bread kiln or oven? There's certainly no evidence here of a lime kiln, unless it was a very early form of lime kiln, little more than a bowl in the earth, called a sow kiln by archaeologists, which has left no trace. Another possibility is a communal corn-drying kiln. It would make sense for sources of fire and danger to the village to be located on the leeward side of the prevailing wind, as this is. When we passed the site of the smithy in the centre of the village, we noted that it was acceptable for communal facilities like that to be built upon common land, and if, where Kiln Scar stands today, there was once a communal oven or kiln, that might explain its encroachment on what was an area of common ground. Time to go back across the road to take another look at that enclosure called Park. We're going to look at it from a place marked on the screen with another yellow pin. It's where a short dogleg section of dry stone wall links to one of the old hedge lines which subdivide Park. From here we'll look across the enclosure. And we're looking in the direction of that group of fields called Hags, the managed coppice, marked just left of top centre and also labelled to the centre right in the photograph. We're searching in the photograph for a ground feature which, from this vantage point, is a couple of scarcely discernible low banks in the middle distance. I've drawn a white line around their position on the ground. It may be easier to see if we move closer to it in the air. I've placed a couple of pins to show where it opens off the small beck and used a white outline to show where, as a shallow channel with a bank on each side, it runs at right angles to the beck. It's a rather puzzling earthwork. Is it a medieval feature? It's probably not a fish pond, as it simply abuts the small beck. We do know from a 12th century charter that there was a vivary or fish pond somewhere in Asby Parish, but this may not be it. Could it have been something very different? Perhaps a watercress bed? We'll go down to ground level to get a better view. This photograph is taken from a position on the far bank of the beck, looking more or less southwestwards into the channel. From here it's a little easier to see the bank on each side of the channel. Watercress was an important addition to diets in medieval times. I don't know to what extent people living in a medieval community would have been aware of the risk of liver fluke infestation as a result of eating watercress contaminated by sheep droppings, if this field was used for sheep rather than cattle or horses. But creating a growing area within banks, which may have been topped by some kind of stock-proof fence or hedge, would have offered some protection for the cress, together with perhaps hurdles at each end. My understanding is that watercress grows only where there is moving water. The fact that there is little or no retaining bank at the far end of this channel may mean that water flowed slowly along it and out into the field. Having said that, of course, might that same water management arrangement make it possible for this to have been a small fish pond? Again, make your choice, fish pond or watercress bed. Or, if you have more thoughts about this structure, do contact me. Interestingly, watercress is still found in this small beck, and it is known by some villagers as the watercress stream. Given that the beck rises, it emerges from the ground within this field called Park, it's almost certainly the watercourse referred to as Park Beck in 17th century records in the Manor Court Book of Asby Winderworth. But that name of Park Beck is no longer used. Further up the field, marked with a red pin on the screen just left of and above centre, is the course of another small beck, which has at some unknown date been diverted to the east or towards the right of the screen to run beneath the trees, above, as we look at it from here, and parallel with the line of Park Beck, and above the position of the feature we've just looked at. Was this diversion made in order to make Park a drier field for livestock, or was it simply to divert the watercourse to increase the sources of water which flowed into a medieval mill pond? We'll find out more about that mill pond a little further on. Beyond the eastern boundary of the field called Park, at another point marked with a red pin here, towards the centre right edge of the screen, stand two gate stoops, or gate posts. These posts, here in an autumn view, liberally covered with moss and lichen, and hidden by vegetation for much of the year, they are all that remained of the pinfold of the Manor of Asby Winderworth. They would most likely have stood within the west-facing wall of that structure. A few pinfolds in the region have survived intact, and others have been creatively reconstructed by land artist and sculptor Andy Goldsworthy. Look out for one in the nearby village of Crosby Ravensworth. This photograph of a surviving pinfold gives you an indication of what the structure near the boundary of Park here may once have looked like, and you can see how the surviving gateposts here in Asby would have fitted into a similar structure. Within the manorial system, pinfolds were enclosures where livestock grazing in fields in breach of manor court regulations, or tethered where they should not be, were held by a manorial officer called the Pinder until payment for their release was made by the owner. Pinfolds were often positioned in places similar to this site at Asby, at a point where open grazing met the enclosed fields of the manor. Remember, open grazing would once have included the land on which the trees of moor plantation at the right of the screen now grow, and moorland beyond that to the northeast, which was not enclosed until the 1870s. For obvious reasons to do with the care of any livestock held in the pinfold, it was close to a supply of fresh water. Indeed, the 1843 tithe map of Asby Parish appears to show that Park Beck actually ran through a corner of the pinfold. This pinfold area was given a new designation after the Asby Winderworth enclosure. If you recall, back at Dale Green, the west end of the village, we noted that a number of resources for public use were created after that enclosure. Dale Green, if you remember, was specified as a public sheep washing place, where sheep would be washed prior to clipping. This pinfold site, beside another small beck, became a different kind of public facility. It was declared a public watering place for livestock. Now we're going to turn our gaze away from the site of the pinfold across to the other side of the road. This area, as you can read, used to be known as Butts Green. Because the area was declared as a place for recreation in that Asby Winderworth enclosure we've just mentioned, it is now known as the Rec or Recreation Ground. The enclosure commissioners directed the person to whom this ground was allocated, and I read their words, to permit it to be at all times used as a place of exercise and recreation for the inhabitants of the township of Asby Winderworth and neighbourhood. In more recent times, it was the village football ground. But long, long before that, this same parcel of ground had a very different role in ensuring the fitness and skills levels of Asby's men. A clue to its purpose is to be found in that name, Butts Green. First, let's dismiss one possible source of its name. One meaning of butts, derived from the Middle English butt, B-U-T-T-E, often meaning a short strip or ridge of ploughland, describes how arable strips of the common field were foreshortened to fit into an awkwardly shaped, tapering piece of land. There is one field in the parish called Butts at Griseburn, which almost certainly acquired its name for this reason. The English Dialect Dictionary suggests that the word can also be used to describe a small enclosure. Neither of these meanings, I think we can be sure, applies to our Butts Green, because there is no evidence that it was ever enclosed or cultivated in medieval or early modern times. If a field in this position, close to the beck, and therefore most likely to be used as meadow, had actually been used for that purpose, it would have acquired a name reflecting that use, a name likely to be derived from one of the Old Norse words for meadow, eng, fitz, or holma. The name of this Butts Green has, I believe, as you can see here, a different derivation, probably from the French word but, same spelling as you can see here as the Middle English word we've just mentioned, but the meaning of this word is mound or hillock. That is one of the reasons why I believe this was the site of the archery butts of medieval Asby. Targets for archery practice would have been placed on the flat tops of circular low mounds, hence the derivation of the name from that French word but, at each end of the placed at each end of the practice area. There are other reasons for coming to the conclusion that this was an area for archery practice, because it does have some of the characteristics of such known practice grounds elsewhere. Here we're looking east across Butts Green to reflect on those characteristics. We can see that it's an area of flat land with some rising ground to the left at its eastern end. Rising ground that may have formed a useful backstop for the archery butts when they were placed at that end. It was also long enough to accommodate the length of a practice area required when an archer was expected to be able to hit a man-sized target at a minimum of 200 yards with an ordinary bow. By 1542, that had become a minimum of 220 yards for anyone aged over 24. It's located on common land at the edge of the village. It's located quite close to the church, and there are examples of medieval churches elsewhere which still have marks on the stonework of their porches, where archers sharpened their arrowheads before practice. In nearby Appleby, the town butts lay just north of St. Lawrence's Church, between it and the River Eden, beyond what is now the cricket ground. In the years long before the construction of the almshouses on Well Green and that house called Banks View, places we've already looked at, you would have been able to walk from the east end of St. Peter's Churchyard straight on to Butts Green. Nearness to the church was important. The first English archery law of 1252 was strengthened by the archery law of 1363, which commanded that each Englishman aged 16 to 60 had to own a longbow that was equal to his own height, and that he had to practice archery on feast days and every Sunday after church. This would have continued until late into the 16th century. Butts may well have been dangerous places when there were so many inexperienced longbowmen on the loose. This risk was recognised at quite an early date, even before the first archery law, when Henry I proclaimed in the very early 13th century that an archer would be absolved of murder if he killed a man during archery practice. Some people have argued that this meant that Butts became a location where old scores were sometimes settled, killings in plain sight, so to speak. But we have no evidence that this was ever the case in Asby. Our route follows the road as it climbs alongside Moor Plantation. To our right, the small Park Beck makes its way across Butts Green to join Asby Beck. As we approach the highest point of the road towards the eastern end of the plantation, there is a wooden and concrete bench in the grass verge on the left, top centre of the screen, marked in red font. This is a good place to pause, but let's walk across the road from the seat to look over a dry stone wall. Here we're looking more or less southeast, towards buildings which make up the Campbell's garage complex on the far side of Asby Beck. The position of the garage is marked towards top right of the screen. At the far side of the field, across the road from Campbell's, and just camera side of the first line of trees, is a group of what seem to me to be unexplained lumps and bumps. Perhaps you can make them out, running left to right across the centre of this photograph. They have some resemblance to small house tofts, with in front of them what might be a track or hollow way. Is it possible that houses of the manor of Asby Coatsford, that remembers the name of the manor on that far southern side of the beck, once extended further eastwards? The position of these possible house tofts appears to be in line with the surviving house further to the west, Town End Farm, and it's possible that what seems to be that hollow way, marked with a red line in front of the lumps and bumps, once formed a continuation of the road from the east end of the village. Shrinkage villages and the abandonment of house plots due to economic change or other causes of depopulation were not unusual events in medieval England. There is clearer evidence of this having taken place in the village of Moulsmeban, a few miles to the northwest of Great Asby. In some places, areas of lost habitation even reverted to become common land, and common land was the status of this field that contains the lumps and bumps at the time of the enclosure of Asby Mask, common grazing of Asby Coatsford Manor, in 1845. The Mask, the name probably derives from Old English MERSC, Mersk, meaning marsh, with the Old Norse SK replacing the SC at the end. The mask starts at the bottom right of the screen. You can see an area of woodland there, which takes its name from the mask. Let's go back to the bench and resume our journey. The road begins to descend with the new cemetery on the left towards a crossroads. Alongside the narrow road to Drybeck, running towards the top left of the screen, once there was more land that remained open common grazing until the Asby Winderworth enclosure. It was part of an area called Long Moor, which lay between here and the hamlet of Drybeck, 1.5 miles to the north. Just past the new village cemetery, our journey takes us along a road to the right, down towards the line of Asby Beck, where we'll pause at the bridge. From that bridge, we're looking downstream. On both sides of the beck there were once meadowlands of the manors of Asby Winderworth and Asby Coatsford. Let's close the photograph and pay attention to some of the names of these meadows. Our eye is following on the ground the line of Asby Beck as it flows towards the top right of the screen. The field names I've added include some of the place name elements that we mentioned earlier when speculating about the meaning of the field name Butts, the archery practice ground. I've put my notes about these names in a text box to make it easier to follow. We have Ings, top right on the Google Earth image, from the Old Norse eng, meaning meadow or pasture. Island, just below and to the right of the Asby Beck label, from the Old English eland, land by a river or island. And Fitz, top right, from the Old Norse fit, riverside grassland. Each of them would have been part, as I've said, of the medieval meadows of the two neighbouring manors. The Ings name here has an additional specific element, byman. This is an attenuated form of bylawman, which was another name for a constable or other manorial official responsible for ensuring that the bylaws or pains of the manor court were abided by. So it's a distant echo of the medieval manors of Asby, because the office was clearly part of the manorial management structure. Perhaps this meadow was one normally allocated to the holder of one of these offices in the manor of Asby Coatsford, for that is the manor this meadow was in. It's often said that these manorial offices were carried out without reward, but in the manor rolls of Hutton John in Cumbria, we find the man charged with keeping the woods in 1576, a bylawman who would probably have been known as a woodward, was given 1 cow geas, that's grass or grazing for 1 cow in the low wood there, for that year. It's also made clear in the Hutton John Manor rolls that any person undertaking the manorial duty of keeper of the woods in the future would have the same right. Perhaps a similar system of reward for one kind of bylawman or byman was in practice or in place in the manor of Asby Coatsford. Opposite Bymanings, on the Asby Winderworth side of the beck, is Mill Moor, a little to the right of top centre here. As far as I can tell, this place did not have any association with the place now known as Asby Mill, which is about half a mile further downstream. And I assume the name of this farmstead is derived from the fact that it was built on open common that had previously been known as Mill Moor. It's very important that you remember the mill element in this minor place name in this location, because we'll be talking more about local mill sites in a little while in part 3. Before we do that, a little about a tannery rather than mills, although this tannery did have a particular kind of mill. We know that in the 18th century a tannery was located here at Mill Moor. Here you can read that the Manor Court Book records that on May the 10th, 1765, a Robert Dover took from John Thompson one messuage and tenement at Mill Moor, consisting of one dwelling house, barn, byre, stable, and then the component parts of a tannery, tanyard, bark mill, drying houses, shop, and finally a garden, one close called the Garth, and another called Broadfield. The 18th century saw a rapid rise in the number of small rural tanneries as economic developments in Britain precipitated a vastly increased demand for leather. This tannery at Mill Moor may well have been born out of this dynamic. It appears to have been established after 1735, and by the early 19th century the holding was no longer described as having the components of a tannery. The tanning process could be smelly and also pollute water supplies, so it's not surprising that Mill Moor is downwind and downstream from the village. Bark mills, and one is mentioned in line 5 of this Manor Court Book entry, were edge mills powered by water, steam, horse, ox or wind, which were used to process the bark, roots and branches of various tree species into a fine powder known as tan bark, used for tanning leather. This powdering allowed the tannin to be extracted more efficiently from its woody source material. But bark grinding was probably an unpleasant task, as the fine dust would have permeated everything. The bark mill here appears to have been water-powered. Let's see if we can find the source of that water power. If we look through a gateway just a little to the left of the bridge we've paused at, I think we can just about see the line of an old mill race, detectable as a rush-filled depression beside a track that leads to that farmstead called Mill Moor in the middle distance. The line of the mill race is at the foot of the sloping ground you can see at the left here. It passes beneath the line of the track before it continues on to go close to a surviving single-storey building at Mill Moor. You can just about see the roof and gable of that building in the distance to the right of the telegraph pole. This building, now known as the Back Byre, may well have been the site of the water-driven bark or edge mill used by Robert Dover or his tenant in the early 1760s. We're going to take a few steps back to the bridge. Until well into the 20th century, the bridge crossing here would have been the site of a ford. We're going to stand with our backs against the steel railings of the bridge and look more or less northwestwards across the road. You can see the other set of the bridge's railings across the road. Facing us is a white painted house called Marble Mill. Marble Mill and its immediate landscape is going to be our focus as we try to understand some pretty complicated phases of water management that may have been associated with the site on which this house stands. Water management that was undertaken to power the milling of different products over a very long period of time, perhaps as much as 700 years or so. Looking at that will be how we begin the final part of our journey as we make our way from here, Marble Mill, back to the Three Greyhounds in part 3. For now, thanks a million for watching. and please come back to join us for part 3 of our Great Asby perambulation.